Jews have ended up in some pretty far-flung corners of the world. But Uzbekistan? This Islamic nation in the heart of Central Asia seems like the last place you'd expect to find a thriving Jewish community. And yet, Jews have called Uzbekistan home for over 2,500 years. They survived wars, empires, and dynasties that rose and fell like sandstorms. Cut off from the rest of the Jewish world for generations, they clung to their faith and tradition.
It's a community that lived on the outskirts of the Jewish diaspora after the destruction of the first temple, and despite all odds, still maintained being, living, and thriving as a Jewish community.
So who are the Bukharian Jews? The story of the Bukharian Jews is a tale of preservation and transformation. Two ideas that seem totally contradictory. But when it comes to identity, nothing is simple. Ask around and you'll get different answers. Some think of Bukharian Jews as Russians. Others call them Sfaradim, Spanish Jews, with customs similar to Middle Eastern Jews. And some even see themselves as indigenous to Central Asia. So, what's the truth? Were the Bukharians a thriving yet isolated community? Or are they quietly hoping for outsiders to help them survive? Even today, the answers are complicated. But to understand who they are now, we need to go way, way back. Their origins trace back to ancient Judea, when the Jews were viciously expelled by the Babylonian Empire. Most Jews languished in Babylon until the Persians took over and let them return home. But some didn't go back. They went deeper and deeper into the Persian Empire. They put down roots in cities along the Silk Road, ending up in what is now known as Iran, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. Bukhara and Samarkand were rich, bustling oases along the Silk Road, perfect hubs for Jewish merchants traveling along the trade routes linking Europe and Asia. And from these crossroads of empire and exile, a new Jewish community grew and thrived. Fast forward to the 8th century, the Persian Empire fell to Arab conquests, and with the Arabs came Islam. Under Islamic rule, Jews were officially second-class citizens. But paradoxically, this era was fruitful for many Jewish communities. Central Asia became a rare refuge, a safe haven for Jews escaping brutal persecution in the Christian Byzantine Empire next door. The diary of one of the world's first travel vloggers gives us some clues about the communities of Central Asia. A 12th century traveler from Spain, Benjamin of Tudela set out across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, chronicling every Jewish community he encountered. His diary describes Samarkand as a prosperous settlement of 50,000 Israelites. Historians think that number might have been an exaggeration, but there's no question that a vibrant community existed in this great city. And these Jews weren't living in isolation. They were closely linked with other Jewish communities scattered along the Silk Road. They wrote to the great rabbinic authorities in Iraq with legal questions. They shared customs, liturgy, even prayer melodies. In many ways, they weren't on the margins of Jewish life at all. They were right in the flow. But then came the Mongols. Genghis Khan's forces swept across Central Asia like wildfire, leveling entire cities, including Bukhara and Samarkand. So what happened to the Jews of Bukhara and Samarkand in the wake of this destruction? No one knows for sure. They may have fled to Persia, Afghanistan, or even as far east as China. Or maybe they never left at all. The historical record goes quiet for a while, but about 150 years later, the Jews of Bukhara and Samarkand resurfaced under a new ruler with a big vision. His name was Timur, a Muslim warlord who conquered Samarkand and set out to rebuild an empire. But to do that, he needed talent. The Jews of Central Asia had a reputation for excellence, especially for weaving and dyeing. So Timur moved hundreds of Jews from Bukhara to Samarkand to build up its economy. How willing they were to relocate, we can only guess. But under Timur and his descendants, the Jews lived pretty well. They owned land and homes. They were merchants, artisans, and doctors, and they dominated the regional textile industry. But the good times didn't last. In the 1500s, a new power swept in. Muslim Uzbeks conquered much of Central Asia and carved the region into religious kingdoms called Khanates. The Jews ended up concentrated in one of them, the Khanate of Bukhara. And here's where the trouble started. The Uzbeks were Sunni Muslims, and they were constantly at the throats of the nearby Shiite Muslims ruling Persia. Within just a few years, the Jews of Bukhara and Samarkand were totally cut off from the Jews in Persia. This was devastating. For centuries, they had been part of a broad Jewish network with shared prayers, shared customs, shared identity. Now, they were alone, no one to turn to for guidance, no nearby community to reinforce tradition, and slowly, a new identity began to take shape, born not of choice, but isolation. They became the Bukharian Jews. This is Professor Menashe Chaimov, a Bukharian Jew who emigrated from Uzbekistan.
Because of the different wars, we lost access to other Jewish communities. So our rabbis, they had to figure out their own system within themselves because they couldn't rely anymore on the rabbis. You send a letter to Iraq, it comes back a year later. It's not feasible for the community to operate.
Cut off from the rest of the Jewish world, the Bukharian Jews were left to chart their own religious path. Isolated, but resilient. But religious independence wasn't the only challenge. Like earlier Muslim empires, the Jews under the Khanate of Bukhara were labeled dhimmi, second-class citizens. They paid a steep jizya tax and followed humiliating laws meant to remind them of their inferior status. Belts, turbans, even the color of clothing marked a person's rank, and Jews were denied certain colors and in some cases, forced to wear a yellow ribbon or star, eerily reminiscent of the Holocaust centuries later. They could ride donkeys, but not horses, so as not to appear taller than Muslims, and they couldn't build homes taller than a mosque.
All of those different discriminatory laws were applied to the Bukharian community, and we were devastated during that period of time.
Under the dhimmi laws, Jews were forbidden from building or even repairing synagogues. But if you visit the city of Bukhara today, you'll see a synagogue that's been standing for over 400 years. This is the Yehudi synagogue, built in 1620 in the Jewish quarter. But the synagogue was not built illegally. As the legend goes, a Jewish widow was pressured by a wealthy Muslim to sell her land so he could use it for a water reservoir. She agreed, but on one condition, that the adjacent plot of land be dedicated for a synagogue. We don't know her name, but we know her legacy. Because of her, the Jews of Bukhara had a sacred space to gather against all odds. Her story captured what it meant to be a Bukharian Jew, negotiating existence, sacrificing for survival. But that survival was tested yet again when the Muslim Mangit tribe took over and styled the region as the Emirate of Bukhara, and they doubled down on persecuting the Jews.
This is what becomes of letting Jews in our city!
And there were instances where a small percentage of people actually converted. They were called Chala Jews, and they converted into Islam. In the public, they would practice Islam or dress or act like Muslims, but then inside the house, they would still keep their Jewish laws.
Less than a decade later, the Bukharian community faced a new kind of upheaval. Not from a conqueror, but from a rabbi. In 1793, Rabbi Yosef Maman, a Sephardic rabbi from the land of Israel, arrived in Bukhara, and he changed everything. He brought strict religious practices, new customs, and a fierce determination to correct what he saw as spiritual decay. His arrival transformed the community, but also divided it, because underneath it all was a deeper question the Bukharian Jews had long wrestled with. Did they need help from the outside to survive? Or had they already proven that they could stand on their own? Rabbi Maman didn't set out to change the course of Bukharian Jewish history. He had originally traveled to Central Asia to fundraise for impoverished Jews in the Holy Land. But when he reached Bukhara, he found a community he believed was spiritually poor. He taught the community new Sephardic customs, practices common among Jews in Southern Europe and the Middle East. To the Bukharians, he was known as Chacham Yosef. And here's where it gets interesting. According to some historians, the community was eager for revival. Centuries of religious oppression had taken its toll, and many Jewish practices had been lost. So the Bukharians saw Chacham Yosef as a beacon who would lead their community out of religious darkness. But not everyone agrees. Other historians argue the Bukharian community wasn't actually on the verge of disappearing at all. Despite their isolation, they had maintained the same knowledge and customs shared with other Jews in Central Asia, guided by a respected leader called Chacham Zechariah Matzliach. And Chacham Yosef's arrival sparked a huge schism among Bukharian Jews who weren't interested in adopting a new Sephardic lifestyle. The followers of Chacham Zechariah wanted to preserve the traditions they had been practicing for centuries. For years, the community was split. But eventually, the followers of Chacham Yosef won out, and the majority of Bukharians adopted his Sephardic ways. Why? Well, like a royal power play, Chacham Yosef married off 2 daughters into influential Bukharian families. His sons-in-law were wealthy, respected, and knew how to build support. Slowly but surely, the old ways were replaced, but at a cost. The Persian liturgy, the unique traditions of Bukharian Jewry, the spiritual legacy they had kept alive in exile, much of this faded into the background. A community that had survived for so long away from the major centers of Jewish life had now taken on a new character. Just a few generations later, everything changed again. This time, for the better. In 1868, Imperial Russia invaded Central Asia and turned the Bukharian Emirate into a puppet state. For the Bukharian Jews, it was the best thing that had happened in a long, long time.
First time in so long, Jewish people have freedom. You don't have to pay jizya tax anymore. You don't have dhimmi status anymore. And you are free to own land. You are free to, ride horses, whatever you want to do. And a big merchant class arises during that period of time. That's where a lot of Bukharian Jews become wealthy. And this is called, amongst historians, the golden age of the Bukharian era.
For centuries, the Bukharian Jews had been second-class citizens, weighed down by taxes and restrictions. Now, under Imperial Russian rule, they could finally breathe. But let's be clear, this wasn't some act of Russian goodwill. Ashkenazi Jews in the Russian Empire weren't so lucky. They were crammed into the Pale of Settlement, where poverty and persecution ruled their lives. The truth is, the Russian Empire did not love its Jews, but it loved what some Jews could do for its economy. The Bukharian Jews had centuries of experience as textile traders and in the cotton markets across Central Asia. So Imperial Russia granted them special privileges, allowing them to become Russian subjects, skip the merchant guild system, and move freely across the empire for trade. In return, Russia could crush its rivals in the textile trade. And during this window, the Bukharian Jews thrived. By the late 19th century, a desire to connect with their ancestral homeland awoke in the Jews of Central Asia. Some Bukharian Jews began making the journey to Ottoman Palestine. They didn't just settle, they built. A new neighborhood rose in Jerusalem, the Bukharian Quarter, funded in part by the growing wealth of the Bukharian diaspora. For a moment, the community existed in two places, one with an eye on the past, the other on the promise of reviving the ancient Jewish homeland. But as always in Jewish history, golden ages are temporary. In 1917, Tsarist Russia collapsed. The Soviets took power, and the good times vanished. The Bukharian Jews lost everything, their businesses, their homes, their freedoms, all seized by the communist regime. Many fled, joining their relatives in mandatory Palestine. Others stayed behind, only to face new trials. Meanwhile, waves of Ashkenazi Jews fleeing the Nazis began arriving in Central Asia, seeking refuge in the same region that Bukharian Jews had called home for centuries. The Bukharian story was entering a new chapter, shaped by war, migration, and the steely grip of the Soviet state. Aaron Aronov still remembers what it was like to be a child welcoming the refugees.
I wanted to take that piece of bread. My father said, don't touch it. This bread for those Jewish people who came from Ukraine, Belarus, Moscow. I said, why such discrimination? Why I cannot? He says, these people buried their parents, their children alive. They had tragedy. Let them eat this. You eat this bread.
Thousands of Bukharian Jews were drafted into the Red Army. Many were killed in battle against the Nazis. Some were taken as prisoners of war, where they passed as Uzbeks in order to survive. When the Bukharian community emerged from World War II, they faced a new world, one where they were once again cut off from their fellow Jews, this time by the Iron Curtain. The Soviets labeled Jews a distinct nationality, but made it nearly impossible to live as Jews. Religious repression forced Judaism underground.
The Soviets wanted to make us Homo Sovieticus. They wanted us forget completely about our traditions, our holidays, and all that. But our mothers resisted, and they have won that battle. Thanks to their efforts, they tried to keep all the children on the Jewish track. Our language, Bukharian language, our traditions, and prayer.
So the Bukharian community adapted, conducting secret Jewish wedding ceremonies and group bar mitzvahs. And through it all, they maintained unique traditions and customs.
In Uzbekistan, right before Pesach, a lot of families had to slaughter a lamb for Pesach because of the idea of Korban Pesach. Grandparents used to dress up as like a poor Jew walking into the room out of nowhere. They would walk in with the clothing and say, "Who am I? I'm a Jew who left Egypt," and really creating and enacting all of that in front of the children.
Honoring their ancestors is a hallmark of the Bukharian Jewish community, and it became a form of quiet resistance, a way to preserve memory and meaning in a world trying to erase both.
One of the biggest value is preservation of the community and making sure you're remembering and honoring your elderly while they're alive, and especially when they're passed.
These memorials are called yushvo, yearly gatherings held on the anniversary of a loved one's death, even decades or centuries later. At a yushvo, families would sit around long tables and share stories about the deceased, so that their children would be able to pass these stories on to their children, and so that these collective memories would live on, generation to generation. They would pray together and eagerly drink up religious lessons from the learned members of the community. And if Soviet agents crashed the party, the celebrants would quietly skip the religious elements and just enjoy an evening of feasting and remembrance. The yushvo tradition predated Soviet rule, but during communism it became a lifeline. These celebrations helped Bukharians cling to their Jewish identity in the face of a regime determined to stamp it out. In the 1970s, a trickle of Bukharian Jews began to leave as Soviet restrictions loosened. In the 1980s, that trickle became a flood.
Mikhail Gorbachev's dreams of holding the Soviet Union together may have received a death blow today.
The collapse of the USSR in 1991 and growing violence in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan pushed thousands to seek a new life elsewhere. Today, only a few hundred Jews remain in Uzbekistan. The heart of the Bukharian community now beats in Israel and New York, with smaller communities across Europe and North America. But transplanting a 2,000-year-old community from Central Asia wasn't easy. Many Bukharian immigrants found that their customs, so carefully preserved for generations, felt alien in American Jewish spaces. They were often assumed to have no Jewish knowledge. But this couldn't be further from the truth. They had preserved Judaism, not lost it. Like all immigrants, they faced the challenge of building a new life, new language, new rules, new culture. But they did not come empty-handed.
When you live in a community where one night you go to sleep and you're in Russia and next day you wake up, you're in the Soviet Union, you cannot rely on a government and you cannot rely on a boss. So you have to figure out a way of trade where it kind of rely on you.
Many Bukharians opened businesses as jewelers, barbers, tailors, dentists, and pharmacists, professions that can be packed up into a suitcase and established anywhere. And they've taken their recipes with them wherever they go. Bukharians still cook their unique cuisine, a variety of dishes influenced by the different cultures that ruled Central Asia.
Like this is Tashkent bread. Very traditional, very soft, very yummy. This is something that we eat every Shabbat. Another interesting part is something that's called chak chak. It's a Asian influence from China, but made from dough and honey. And usually people eat it together and drink it with tea. I do not recommend eating this all by yourself because then you would have to buy a second subscription for the gym.
The story of the Bukharian Jews is a tale of resilience carved in exile. Cut off from the Jewish world, forced to convert, forbidden to pray. And still, they never stopped being Jews. The last century tested their endurance to the limits, but the Bukharians emerged with their identity intact. And even now, as assimilation looms and traditions evolve, they've committed to keeping their story alive, to remembering where they came from, and to making sure that the world doesn't forget their extraordinary history.